Hello and welcome to the brand new American Reformation podcast. We long to see the wider American Christian church fall more in love with Jesus by learning from the practices of the early church and other eras of discipleship multiplication. We want to hear from you. Make sure you comment and leave a review wherever you're watching or listening to tell us what God is doing in your life or how you feel about today's conversation. Lord, have your way in us. Let's dive in.
Welcome to the American Reformation podcast. Tim Allman here today with my brother from another mother. His name is Chad Lakies, Reverend Dr. Chad Lakies, and Chad and I met at a kind of leadership gathering hosted by Concordia Publishing House, CPH, and Lutheran Church Extension Fund, and we realized, which happens quite a bit in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, that we had a lot of overlapping streams and relationships. So a little bit about Chad before we get into our conversation today. He was a part of if you're in the St. Louis community, you've heard of Crave. While he was a student and a vicar in St. Louis, he was a part of Crave, then got his PhD and went and served at Concordia University in Portland right before their closure a number of years ago, and now he has landed at Lutheran Hour Ministries. There's so many Concordias and Lutherans going on. Lutheran Hour Ministries, and we're going to hear a little bit about his work. But before we do that, Chad, welcome to the American Reformation podcast. Standard question: how are you praying, brother, for Reformation, just at the broad level in the American Christian church today? Welcome, brother. Thanks for your time.
Tim, thanks for having me. Real quickly, for your listeners, I've just come to realize how good of a listener you actually are. And so, yeah, that'd be one prayer, that more of us are surrounded by people who are willing to listen. Other prayers are that the generational difference that seems to exist in the church between sort of the old guard, people who've been kind of Lutheran their whole life, brought up this way, sort of known it one way forever, would more and more interact with a spirit of listening, humility with those who are younger. I used to not be a Lutheran or even a Christian, but there are many more who are trying to come even after you and I, to figure out what does it mean to be a Christian in our time. And there seems to be some kind of discontinuity between what they're experiencing and feeling and wrestling with, and the ways that kind of have been, for the older Christians, tried and true, and, well, why would we think about it any other way, do it any other way? But those are still, I think, good and curious questions where both groups can kind of press on and mold one another. But I'm not sure that wherever we finally end up, it's going to land in the sense of, one side saying, hey, see, I was right all along. But maybe God is up to something new. And I'm just praying that the opportunities to listen and learn from one another, especially generationally, would be fostered.
Yes. Right before we went on, we're talking about reading the new large catechism put out by CPH, and with contemporary applications, annotations, all of that, and many wonderful contributions there. But Luther's preface to the large catechism and his real call, he gets pretty harsh, you could say, with a lot of pastors who are no longer learning, staying in the Word, staying in catechesis. And I think if I could just boil it down, he is calling for humility. Readers are leaders, and I pray that more of our leaders would have that sense of humility. Humilitas is a book, and I just remembered the name of the author. John Dixon came out with a book called Humilitas, and he looked at the origin, Chad, of humility. Did you ever read that book? Is it ring a bell at all?
Nope, I'm not even.
So he did a study out of a university in Australia, secular study on the origins of humility, because he was looking at emperors and kings that had gone before, and a lot of times in the historical annals, they would even exaggerate their accomplishments, right? But somehow, over the last 2,000 years, this sort of boasting in culture in general is looked down upon. And so he was like, looking, when did this shift occur? Where humility, especially among those who are in positions of power, is elevated. It is a strong character trait. And newsflash, it all oriented around the person and work of Jesus Christ, God in the flesh, who humbled himself, Philippians chapter 2, even to the point of death on the cross. And out of that, God elevated him. The Father elevated him. So the more we know about one respective discipline, maybe it's exegesis or history or science in general, the more we know, and then you've got a number of different streams and all of those kind of disciplines, right? The more we know about one respective stream, the more it should humble us in how little we know about the other respective streams. To go deeper on that, do you think that's one of the areas where, because you spent a lot of time contemplating how to disciple the next generation and maybe young adults who may be skeptical, is it that that pride of this is the way, you must do it like this? I'm speaking in very general terms here, but do you think that's one of the things that sounds and smells, gross to the younger generation? Go deeper in terms of humility and intergenerational connection.
I don't know if it necessarily smells gross. I think there are a lot of young people out there who realize people who've lived longer than them, been doing it longer than them, have wisdom to offer. But they, I think, don't feel as if they are treated with a similar kind of respect, right? That maybe they've learned something that they could teach the old dogs, right? That in a sense, all of us are still able to learn new tricks. Luther, his character, he seemed to fail this way all the time. And it could be something like a deathbed confession, but I think it's more consistent throughout his theology. I mean, even in some of his earlier works, like the Heidelberg Disputation, there's a lot of sense of humility about what we can know there. And Luther was pushing back significantly on, a certain kind of speculative theology. But at the end of his life, he says, all of my books, they're straw, right? I mean, the only one that he wanted to keep where he thought he did something really good and made a significant contribution was, on the bondage of the will. And if only all of us could have an attitude like that. But we don't have to go back for such old models. I mean, Luther is a kind of paragon model for us in the Reformation tradition. But I really liked David Brooks, the New York Times columnist, his book, A Road to Character. He was actually writing it in the midst of a period of time where he was on the road to converting to Christianity from kind of a secular Judaism. And he tells that story in a second book called The Second Mountain. But essentially, he just tells story after story after story in that book, The Road to Character, about how, after the 1950s, it really seemed like we were coming out of a societal moment when there was a lot of self-effacement. Like, we're not so great. Post-World War II, there's victory, and there's a certain sense of, we just need to be thankful for this moment and embrace it. Because at the same time there's victory, of course, there's the recognition of so much loss and destruction and horrible things committed by humans. But then he goes on to tell the story of a number of people who struggled through how to deal with their own limitations and weaknesses and find a way to be successful. And many of those people were connected to God in some way, had some sort of religious background. And I think they served in a sense as a witness to him, right? He just studied their lives. And in addition to that, and a number of other influences, he came around to be a follower of Jesus himself.
That's powerful. Who's the author of The Road to Character? What's his name again?
Yeah, David Brooks is his name.
David Brooks. Mm-hmm. Check that out, bro. That's awesome. So what I was fascinated about is your conversion story, coming to faith later in life, and how that shaped your ministry, brother. Can you share that story?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. I converted to Christianity, became a follower of Jesus in the middle of my freshman year of college. Prior to that, I'd grown up in a nominally Christian home. And by that, really, it was Christian in name only. We were Roman Catholic. I was catechized all the way through from about first or second grade on through eighth grade. Pretty similar experience, I think, from what I understand, confirmation programs to be for people in the Reformation tradition. But I walked away from that kind of not really knowing the significance of Jesus. Not sure if that was the teacher's fault or if it's mine, just from not paying attention all that well. But I encountered kind of the end of that period where, in a sense, it's this moment in the 8th grade where you kind of put on the cloak of faith and own it for yourself. They kind of treat you like an adult, and this is your confession now. And in a sense, you're kind of kicked out of this formative environment to sort of keep it for yourself, in a sense. And because there's nothing going on in my home life, there's nothing really to make it sticky. Important in ways that are bigger and beyond, just the sort of, well, this is a good idea to be part of the church. I wanted the first ticket that I could find out of some of those obligations, like going to church randomly whenever my parents would decide to do so, which was not more than, maybe very few times per year. But I didn't want to do it, and I didn't know why we were doing it. And so I didn't really feel like I was leaving anything behind because there wasn't that rootedness. So all through high school, I was an atheist. I encountered the biological theory of evolution in freshman biology class, and I thought that made a lot of sense of things. And it really does, I think we should recognize, have very strong explanatory power that we've got to wrestle with as Christians in the modern age. But a parallel story to all of this is, since I was a little kid, I've been playing drums, and my dad had a kiddie drum set that as soon as I was able to sit in a chair, I was sitting down. I remember the beat that I would make up, even till this day. And then I got into organized music in my school district and played in everything, like all of the ensembles, the marching band, even had some garage bands and basement bands when I was in high school. And every kind of music you can think of, all the venues, right? From the crappiest dive bar where I thought me and my drums, we're going to fall through this rickety stage, to like NFL football stadiums for marching band state competitions, and,
Wow.
Just seriously, everything in between. And then I was playing finally at the end of high school in a Blues Brothers cover band, taking songs from that classic movie, and we had a bit of a choreographed act. And it's because the arts program at our school was so good that all of us were able to kind of put this together. There's about 10 guys. Played some shows, won a contest, played a bunch of graduation open houses. And then, of course, we had to all go our separate ways for college. But while we were rehearsing, it was in the garage of one of the lead singers. His mom was a Lutheran Church praise team leader. She heard me and thought I could hack it well enough, and offered, that I would come play drums at their church. And I said, well, wait a minute, I'm an atheist, right? And she said, yeah, we know. And so I thought of it, and I'm okay, I'll do it if it's a gig. I'll take it if you pay me. So they said, okay. And so I started showing up roughly the middle of that summer, right after high school graduation, playing drums in church. What I experienced in that period of about 6 months was two things. I went in with a lot of trepidation. I was worried, are you going to try to shove Jesus down my throat? Are you going to beat me over the head with the Bible and tell me I'm an immoral person because I'm an atheist? And there's this presupposition that atheists have no morality. They didn't do any of those things. In fact, I was welcomed with open arms and welcomed into an environment of a bunch of more mature musicians than me. They'd been playing together for a while. They'd done lots of different things. I learned how to play live music without a conductor with them, through a lot of listening. Again, it's a super important thing for musicians. And then I really kind of wanted God to make himself tangible. If I'm going to believe this stuff that you're talking about, yeah, I have a lot of objections, but I want God to, make it like tangibly real to me. Hello, Chad, repent and believe the gospel. I need to hear that audibly, or it's written up on the wall somewhere, something like that. And neither of those things happened. But what did happen was playing drums there, I felt like I played better, and I had more fun than all these other venues and previous kinds of musical style or ensemble I'd been in. I couldn't really explain that. So that genuine Christian hospitality that I experienced, and the sense of playing drums in that environment, maybe this God is real. Maybe he created me to have this ability, and maybe when I use it for him, it goes better. I didn't know. I still really don't know the answer to that question, but it was enough to become a tipping point. So in the middle of my freshman year, I went to bed one night and I said, God, I still don't know if you're real, but I'll give you a chance. And that changed everything about my life. I went from being somebody who didn't really like school to, I suddenly was devouring books, trying to answer the questions that I had to deal with the conversion experience. I started to like to write a little bit. I fairly quickly felt the call to go to seminary, and people at that congregation, poured into me and said, we see that aptitude in you too. And so off I went. And God does what God does. There's a number of tangential bits to that story, but yeah, that's the basic bit.
That's so amazing. I mean, I want to be, and you don't have to share the church, but like we need more, unless you want to, we need more churches like that, man, that just open-handedly love and meet young people, old people too, people that have questions, doubts, to just show Christian hospitality to them. And I'm sure you can go off on a number of different stories. Like if this is the heaviness around, I mean, it's all the Lord's, and so there's a lightness to it, but like the work of inviting the stranger, the sojourner, those that are just trying to figure life out. And this is for all of God's people, because I bet if there was one person in that story, Chad, could have been a church leader, elder, pastor, whatever, that come up and said, and given you like the slightest hint early on that you were not welcome, you would have bounced. Is that true?
It might have been a little more pressure was required in that moment because I had made a commitment to them, right? This was a gig. They were paying me. I knew how to be professional, right? This wasn't my first rodeo in that regard. I'd already done a little bit of gigging prior, and my parents raised me with a certain kind of ethic, that I might have talked to the leaders about, well, hey, this person said blah, blah, blah to me, what do I make of that? But I probably wouldn't have bailed unless there was a lot of pressure.
Yeah, sure. But nonetheless, you didn't receive any of that. I mean, it was just open.
No.
Arms,
and
right?
To get to your point, I think in terms of the character of this church, they took a risk, right? By bringing someone in who didn't share any of their confessional commitments and then put them into a leadership position effectively, right? I'm up there leading music, right? And I could have probably misbehaved a lot, said a number of things like, I don't believe this is silly, you all are stupid. I probably could have done a number of really damaging things, and they probably would have booted me to the curb real fast. But they welcomed me. A number of people were praying for me. It's the Spirit was just at work to get me in.
That so shaped then the rest of your life up to this point, Chad, because tell our listeners about your PhD and why you got the PhD in the discipline you received it, and then move into your Concordia Portland kind of experience, if you would.
Yeah. So I knew as I was going through the pastoral formation program that I wasn't really sure that serving a congregation in the traditional sense was the right fit for me. And so I started looking at grad school and applied for PhDs at a variety of places and was rejected at two of the places that I applied to. They wanted me to know exactly what topic I wanted to work on so they could slot me with an advisor and so on. So it wasn't because of, I didn't have the merit, my grades were good enough and so on. But I just didn't sort of fit their mold of how they wanted to recruit new students. So I stayed in the Concordia Seminary in St. Louis, welcomed me to keep studying. And slowly, over a lot of conversations, I worked out my thesis topic with my Dr. Father Joel Okamoto. He knew me from, the very first year that I was there as a student. And for whatever reason, I was very attracted to how he thinks. And, he knew this side ministry that I was doing at Crave and really planting a new church and trying to figure out how to get that off the ground, do it faithfully, but in a bit of a different style than was typical in our church body. And so as I got going, one of the things that I figured out was I want to understand how it is that the church sort of gets off track of where God wants it to go and becomes unwittingly captive to American culture. And so I really did a lot of work on figuring out, what does it mean for the church to be a community, formed as a community, a place that is full of habits and rituals and so on that aim us to be a particular kind of people. That's what the liturgy does and is supposed to do. But that connection to community, one of the big weaknesses is for us American Christians is it's just an hour on Sunday, and that's not a formative enough of an environment. And so as we live in another environment, deeply immersed, we carry in a lot of practices and habits out of that environment. We start to apply them to life in the church, and then unwittingly we're captive to the ways of American culture and are forming better Americans than we are Christians. And so I really highlighted 3 different ways we do that. I talked about preaching as being captive to the therapeutic, right? The triumph of the therapeutic. It's a book that was really written very prophetically in the 1960s by a guy named Philip Rieff, a Jewish sociologist of culture out of the University of Pennsylvania. And essentially our preaching is captive to that in the sense that our preaching is most often functioning as trying to make people feel better and helping them cope with the challenges of life. And it even comes across when we say very gospel-oriented things like, it's all okay, Jesus died for your sins. Well, actually, it's not okay, right? Because in a horizontal relationship between us and God, right, we're clean. The blood is shed. We're made white as snow. Sorry, that was vertical.
Yeah, vertical.
On the horizontal, us to people, there's still consequences for my actions, right? So yeah, I could forgive you for that divorce or for lying against me or for, countless things in a Christian way, but there's still consequences, right? There's a cost. And so I think our preaching needs to deal with that more significantly. And I think in many ways, the Lutherans are very good at that. 2 others very quickly. I think when we talk about the doctrine of vocation, it's often really narrow and captive to the culture of total work, right? So it's a kind of work hard, give it your all because Jesus gave his all for you, which flip-flops the gospel, turns it into a law, right? The good news is Jesus gave us all for you, so go do what he did. Well, none of us are capable of that. It's just a gift to be received. And so I think our sense of vocation is very narrow, and Luther meant it much more broadly and huge. And then last, when we try to reach out and get people into our church, be attractive, relevant, it turns evangelism into a kind of a marketing project. It's not really introducing people to Jesus as much as it's trying to get them into our place, right? Maybe to do things like pay the bills, keep the lights on, right? Be the big successful looking church compared to all the other people in town. And it's just motives get a little messed up. So that's what I worked on.
Good.
And
what were your conclusions? I mean, that was general hypotheses that kind of went in. And then, what observations did you make? You kind of hinted at it with the Lutherans and our law gospel preaching. Like we are not the consumerist preachers. We will make the comfortable uncomfortable and vice versa. So by law and gospel, what other observations though, especially around vocation, did you kind of discover? And because I'm geeking out right now on a number of different, I think we need more people doing sociological coupled with theological studies right now. So just go a little bit deeper, Chad. It's fascinating. Yeah.
So all of them kind of circled around this pre-work that I did on ecclesiology. What does it mean to be a church community that has, practices that are supposed to lead to habits, which are supposed to lead to a certain way of being, right? If you think in Aristotelian terms, it's kind of carrying out the virtues, but really we can talk about it in a Lutheran sense of, forming real disciples of Jesus, authentic followers of Jesus, right? There's a certain character that goes with that. Maybe you can call it virtue, but traditionally we just use the biblical language of someone who lives more and more like Jesus. That's what our practices are meant to do. And so I was really, every time I dealt with one of those issues, bringing it back around to what does an authentic, orthodox, genuine biblical practice look like that brings us back to being a follower of Jesus, where we reflect his ways before the watching world. And so, yeah, I totally agree with you. Thinking about how to marry theological and sociological talk, where theology is always, the primary voice, but understanding what we can from many of these other disciplines that teach us about the way communities function, for example, is really helpful for the church and eminently practical.
Eminently practical. So I'm fascinated with the power of habit and how that shapes the Christian. And Jesus was obviously, I like to frame it like this, that it's not what would Jesus do. Jesus is perfect. Jesus, holy God, holy man, 100% healthy, could differentiate and stay connected. There's some systems work there. Just the superhuman man. So it's not what would Jesus do, but it's what did Jesus do on his way to fulfilling his mission? What were the practices of Jesus? So could you nail in on some of those Christian formation practices that you think the everyday baptized follower of Jesus would do well to emulate?
Sure. There are even things that I'm not good at or not consistent about. I mean, I'm as weak as any other Christian, right? But at Lutheran Hour Ministries, we talk about basic spiritual disciplines like reading your Bible, right? Being in the Word, or reading something that helps you get into the Word, like a devotion. Then we would talk about, of course, being a part of Christian community. So being in church every single Sunday, because that's where God delivers his gifts. That's where he does his work, right? We're kind of always passive receivers of his formative work. That's where the Spirit is. And when we do it together with others, there's so much more power than when we're trying to do it individually. Prayer is another one, right? Where you find ways to talk to God, but even more so practice trying to listen to how he's moving you through life. But it's always a posture, I think, in prayer where you're sort of, you're humbled, right? You're sitting before this awesome, awesome God who is nevertheless inviting you to be there, to hear you. But at the same time, while he's listening, he's involved in forming and shaping you to be the sort of person who hears with a different set of ears, sees the world and other people in it in a different way, right? You're being molded to be a little more Christ-like in all of those sorts of practices. They're very basic. There's lots of other ones in the Christian church. Silence and solitude, I think, are huge and necessary in our time because of the way that we can get so pulled into like our devices and the alternative realities that they offer to us. I'm a big reader, reading books and all the different ways that other people make arguments that change my mind. And effectively, I take that to be God working through them to reveal something bigger to my imagination about him and this creation that he has made, right? So every time my assumptions are challenged, that's formative as well.
Amen. No, that's so good. It really is the simplicity and then setting the rhythm. And I'm a morning guy, and if I don't start my morning moving my body and through movement of body allowing the mind to be moved more and more after the heart and mind of Jesus, again, we're not pursuing perfection, just progress here, just meditating on the word. The miracle morning for me, Chad, is like push-ups, planks, prayer, word, all of that kind of to get myself going. So again, there's so much grace in this conversation. We're following Jesus, right? I mean, we've been baptized into his name. He's not ashamed of us. He loves us. He knows our frailty. He knows how our desires get misoriented and how much we just want to be around him because his Spirit lives within us. He's so near to us. And I think as we talk about the younger generation, you and I now, we're roughly the same age. We're firmly in middle ageville there, Chad, and I'm owning it. It's okay. It's cool. I got 3 kids in their teen years right now. But talk about, especially in your work at Concordia Portland, some of the misconceptions that maybe our older Jesus followers may have of our younger Jesus followers today? And how did your work there at Concordia Portland kind of shape your understanding of that next generation?
Yeah, I think a big misunderstanding that came out about a decade or so ago is the sense that, millennials and the early Gen Zers are something like the me generation, that they're all just a bunch of narcissists. And there's so much alternative research to counter that, but that message kind of got into the popular mainstream media. And then of course, there's always sort of this interesting tendency amongst older generations looking down on younger generations and seeing that they're handling the world differently. They've got different problems and challenges than the older generations have. And we've got a bad memory as older generations. Like, if looking back, we've made it so far in life, and it feels like what we went through wasn't as difficult before. And so when we see younger generations going through something difficult, we're like, what's wrong with them? Why do they have so many problems? But in addition to that feeling and that sensibility is this sense that they're all about me, the me generation. They're all a bunch of individualistic people. But the counter research actually says, no, they are people who are looking to be a part of something bigger than themselves. They want to leave a mark on the world. They're already thinking at a young age about their legacy. How, in a sense, how will they be remembered? They might not articulate it that way, but when you talk about leaving a mark on the world, they're thinking about how will I be remembered? And so I think for us, as people who are working with young people, we've got such a great opportunity in terms of inviting them into the Christian story. Because what better story to invite them into than the one of the grandeur of God working in the world, right? Paul says Christ was in the world reconciling, right? Mm. That's one way of characterizing it. Luther talked about, his classic doctrine of vocation, and it talks about every single role that you might have in life. Some that are permanent. You're born a son or a daughter. You're never not a son or a daughter. Some that come later and endure, becoming a spouse or a parent. Some that are temporary, being a certain kind of employer or employee or a student or a volunteer, and on, right? Being a citizen. All of these things help you see every aspect of your life as a role through which God is reaching down from heaven to use you, as if Luther would say, behind a mask, right, yeah, to work and care for his neighbors. So the most mundane, ordinary, and often undesirable and gross things, the stuff that we don't want to do, like changing diapers. You can actually flip that whole story and say, this service to my little baby has eternal significance. Mm. Right? And so for moms and dads who are just deep into that kind of parental element of life, and it's a difficult part of, this child is super needy, right? But that takes us back into, the gospel, Matthew 18 and the focus on the child and that whole series of passages that are classic to us. What Jesus is doing and holding up the child is holding up the needy one. And it's always us, right? We're always the needy one. And everyone around us is always the needy one. And Luther tells this grand story of vocation where God's reaching down through us to involve us in the work of caring for the needy ones. And I don't know what better story to use to say, here's how you can be a part of something bigger than yourself. And here's how you can leave a mark on the world. It might not be one that they write about in the history books, but it has eternal significance. And I think that's better. And so I would just try to invite students into that. And then, because of my background, formerly being a non-believer, I wanted them to see what it meant to be an authentic Christian who didn't know how to do this walk very well. I've learned a lot of theology, but I'm still being formed in how to follow Jesus well. And so see someone who would make mistakes admit the mistakes, ask for forgiveness, see someone who is quote unquote an expert, right? I'm the professor, but I don't have all the answers, to say, you know what, I don't know. That's okay. I think I know how to find this out, and walk with me on this journey to figure out what you want to know. Right. So those sorts of things are just, we've got a world of opportunity before us if we can see it through that lens.
Yes. Wow. So much there. So I would invite, maybe older, and I'm in my 40s, but the 60-year-old follower of Jesus, I think there's always in every generation been that desire for more and a life of significance and to be connected to something bigger, which is the grandeur of God. I think back, the World War II generation, and a number of kids here in the United States of America were like, I will go. Like every kid and lady for that matter was like, we are all united around this mission. How much greater, rather than one country fighting or countries fighting other countries, is the grandeur of the calling of God in our various vocations, using the unique gifts that God has given to us. So I think if we can kind of tap into that, and especially we got older generations who come down to say, I remember what it was like. You're going to be okay. The Lord is good. And let me be a spiritual, we don't use these terms very well, I would say, in the church, but a spiritual father and mother for you, to be a part of that kind of village mentality. Because, man, I need a lot of other adults speaking words of life and love into my teenagers right now, to cast vision for their life, to let them know they're not alone. Obviously, Christ and community is going to be there for them. So go deeper in terms of the solid invitation for an older adult starting to maybe disciple a younger child that may not be necessarily their child or grandchild. Because I think there's a lot of opportunity for the church to grow in that effort. Thoughts there, Chad?
Yeah. So one thing that we try to do in my house is we have a neighbor kid over fairly regularly, and she kind of just gets to see how we are, because I really don't know what her family background is. We've not gotten to know her parents very well, but they trust us at being able to have her over. And she's got a number of much younger siblings, and I think they're a handful over there for mom and dad. And so the older kid's bored. And mom is preoccupied with the much more significant needs of the younger one. So she comes over, plays with my kids, and we make lunch, and we have a lunch prayer, and we talk about things the way that we normally would, but it's this like slow drip of exposure to Jesus and the way of the Christian life, and the formation then that we've got to do with our kids as they're growing up and they're figuring out how to have this social relationship with one another. There's often a lot of guidance of pointing out, what's important about how to get along. And that always comes from our Christian foundation. When you talk about older kids, I think you're talking about the fact that you're assistant football coach for your kids' football team, right? And what better environment, especially for young men, to be formed by older, more mature men, wiser men, but men who sort of have this spirit of wanting to pour into young people. I remember growing up, one of my best friends, his father had committed suicide, and he really had no fathers. And I watched him a number of times kind of latch on to my dad in a way. And my dad did what he could to really pour into him and just be a good male presence in his life. But he didn't have enough of those. And so, he made a few not great choices in his early adult years, that I think he's still paying some of the consequences for. He's found his way better, but it was really a challenge. When we look out there at our congregations, or even our neighborhoods, the school classes where our kids are spending most of their time, we don't have to, I think, manufacture a lot of opportunities and think, I've got to do something really unique and special to be able to pour into the lives of young people. I had it easy as a professor. I had a captive audience, for 15 weeks at a time, a number of them, in fact. And so that was easy for me. Now I'm trying to find ways to do it with my daughters, and then some of the kids that she's hanging around with at church, or some of the school friends that she'll have over on occasion. But we're just sort of getting to that age where they're spending more time together outside of the school day and the classroom. It's not the greatest answer I don't feel like I'm giving you, but it's just simple, it's ordinary, it's mundane, right? It's where we live. There are ways that you can just sort of think about this ahead of time and think, this is who I want to be when we're together.
Yeah,
excuse me.
Chad, I couldn't agree more, man. It's simple. Just invite a kid the Lord places on your heart. You see the kid that's by him or herself. You've maybe got a connection to the mom or dad, connect to your church, and just ask if you could take him out to a game, to coffee. If it happens to be a friend, just invite him into your world. We had a young man by the name of Nico that went on a week-long vacation with us in a number of different families. And the connection, the natural connection, it wasn't weird that now I have the rapport that I have with Nico could pay dividends all the way through our high school years together. So it is very, very simple. This is the simple work that I think that Lutheran Hour Ministries is really calling people to. So tell our listeners a little bit about your work and how Lutheran Hour is just getting after it right now in very creative and yet simple ways as it relates to discipleship.
Yeah, one of my favorite things about Lutheran Hour is we have kind of always been the same organization. So most people know us. They're most familiar with the Lutheran Hour, the radio program that's on every single Sunday across the country and in parts of Canada. We're a mass media gospel proclamation organization. We've been doing that for, this is going to be in September, the 91st season of the Lutheran Hour. So we've been doing that before anybody else, any other Christian group got into media. And now we do it all over the world with social media and videos and bringing people together to show movies and pretty much anything that you can think of that's media-based, radio, still especially television, satellite TV. We're just sort of flooding these areas of the world with subtle, friendly, winsome gospel presentations. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do, especially in the United States, is really emphasize this idea of how can we Christians gain a hearing in our time? And especially, I think, critical in a time when there's so much confrontation and antagonism between people groups, the church and culture, the church and society. How can Christians, be a positive witness to the kingdom other than being winsome, being authentic, being who you say that you are, living that life of humility, asking for forgiveness when you screw up, serving where you can, right? Seeing needs, meeting them, just like the Good Samaritan, right? Our neighbors are who God brings into our life that we have the capability of serving. It's no esoteric sort of thing. It's as simple as that. And these are the things we're just trying to emphasize. And we're trying to talk about how households are places of spiritual formation, so that if you do it there, as I was talking about just a minute ago with my daughter and the young lady who comes over, if we do it here, we might give off a very basic Christian witness that is winsomely enough received, generates enough trust in a number of Christians that, look, even if we're not somehow responsible for her joining the church at some point, we've left a mark so that maybe as God brings her into contact with other Christians over time, they might water that seed, as it were, right? And eventually she becomes a part of God's family. Maybe her family becomes a part of God's family. Who knows?
Yeah.
Right. Just being faithful.
That's wonderful. That is wonderful. And I'm grateful you're a part of Lutheran Hour Ministries and excited to see how your work has a ripple effect into the future. So one of our last questions, this is a podcast of the Unite Leadership Collective, and we're unashamedly leaders within the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and we're also making some statements about how we believe in written and verbal form we could be restored to health. Leaders could be more healthy. We could have not just quantity but quality of pastors and other leaders for the future of the church, which is going to look different than it has in a mostly, Christian America, etc. So any words of hope for, say, what does the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod not just look but feel like in your mind, say a decade from now? How would you hope the character of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, the culture of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod would grow and become more like Christ, Chad?
Yeah. Let me try to do that by marrying a number of threads that we've talked about in this podcast. So I think if I were to look ahead, the church that I would like to see is one that has come to grips with the fact that we're maybe living in a world historical moment, right? You and I talked about Phyllis Tickle's book.
That's right.
Is it The Great Reformation?
The Emerging Church or Emerging Christianity?
The Great Emergence. The Great Emergence.
Great Emergence. There we go.
And so her point at the very end of that book, and, it's just a hypothesis, is every 500 years, the church has what she calls a rummage sale. And, so you've got birth of Christ, the fall of Rome, and 500 years later, the split between East and West, roughly 500 years after that, the Reformation. And, now we're about 500 years out from then, right? Is something happening? I don't know, but it sure feels like things are convulsing substantially, not just in the church, but in the society, especially Western society where we live.
Yes.
Major changes going on. Is her hypothesis right? I have no idea, but maybe. And if we lean into the possibility that maybe we're on the verge of something, a move of God, I think it's going to come out of this sense that this amount of fracture, splintering, polarization, antagonism in our society is something that all of us see and survey upon survey saying we're massively dissatisfied with. We don't like this about ourselves, but we don't know what to do about it. I think the church can lead the way because Jesus teaches us a number of things, right? Every time we run into someone who believes something different than us, holds something sacred in their core, their convictions, is different than us, Jesus never let those issues prevent a relationship. I mean, we always focus on sin, right? He never let our sin prevent a relationship, but expand that way that Paul characterizes it in Romans 5, right? While we were still his enemies, I think that we tend automatically to be, because we're immersed in this culture, to be captive to the cultural imagination of thinking that someone who disagrees with me or has a different set of convictions or beliefs or ideas or opinions than me is my enemy, and I've got to dissociate from them. We can't talk to each other. We can't interact. We've got to get away from one another. And I think if we can learn to see other people through the lens of Jesus, that he has shed his blood for all of them, whether or not they acknowledge it or not, right? It comes from a sense, I think, that I don't belong. I wasn't deserving. I was his enemy when he shed his blood for me. That shapes my perspective for how I engage with any them, right? Whether that's a person or an institution or a group of people that I don't necessarily feel like I share their viewpoint or I love what they think about. That opens a space, I think, for us as church leaders, one, to say, I can lead despite everything that I do isn't going to be something everyone loves. That when I encounter disagreement, when I encounter pushback, it doesn't mean I'm encountering an enemy. Maybe there's something about restoring more of a reformed idea of I think Abraham Kuyper called it loyal opposition, that leaders can surround themselves with people who are going to push back on their leadership only for the sake of helping that leader actually advance themselves for the greatest possible good that they can do. And if we can model that then as Christians by engaging with these other people in a greater spirit of openness because Jesus went to them and we are sent to them as well, then maybe, just maybe, we can rebuild the trust that we have lost in our time, and we can shine the light of the gospel in the world in a much healthier way.
Yes. This is so fun, Chad. I've loved learning with you today. Just a clarion call for humility, regardless of your respective vocation or role within the church. If we all prayed for that and sought it connected to Jesus, the humble one, who gave it all for us, who's coming again for us, man, how much more healthy would, and I believe will, the church be into the future. This has been a lot of fun. Chad, if people want to connect with you, how can they do so?
Best way is by email. My email is chad.lakies, Lakies, at lhm.org. I'm also on
Lakies. I love it. Where are you at?
I'm also on socials, Facebook and Twitter. I'm more of a passive user of those things. I don't post a lot, but you can contact via private message on those channels as well.
Cool. Very cool, man. This has been a lot of fun. Listener, sharing is caring. Please like, subscribe. We'll continue to have wonderful, hope-filled conversations about how the Lord he's always doing a new work connected to his never-changing word. And I do believe we are in one of those seminal pivotal moments right now within the American Christian church, the church across the globe. And the Lord wants us individually and collectively to play our role connected to the holy habits that you talked about, to shed the love and light and life of Christ into this dark and dying world. It's a good day. Go and make it a great day. We'll be back next week on the American Reformation Podcast. Thanks so much, Chad.
Thanks for having me, Tim.
Yeah, bud. It's a good time.